Thank you, Abhinav. I'm quite amazed at the organization of this event. First time I'm coming here because, every time this happens, it's coinciding usually with the India Art Fair, which is what's happened this time also. Unfortunately, this time I've also, as of yesterday, developed my usual Delhi pollution chest. But I hope my voice lasts through the few minutes. 15 minutes, I was told, and I have my large timer with me to try and keep it. A number of the issues that have already come up today, actually, I hope will run through some of the presentation I do. And it's a slightly unusual one, I hope, in the context of this series on architectural photography. This is that's the filial connection. That's my father on the left with Nehru. My father was one of the few architects who actually studied in the US in the 1940s. We only had 3 architecture schools in India at independence. He had studied engineering in Calcutta, but went to MIT to do engineering, but shifted over there to architecture. And one of the main influences on him was Walter Gropius, who was actually teaching in Harvard. He came back to India, and one of the first projects he did was this memorial to Gandhi. This is Gandhi Ghat in Calcutta. And I'm giving you a little bit of this background because it's because of this background that my own kind of sensibility and practice has evolved. It's emerged from actually growing up in this environment. This was done in 1948, 49, sorry. Gandhi's assassinated in 48. This was the first memorial to Gandhi built in India. This is in Barrackpur in the north of Calcutta. And it was opened by Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, Chandigarh had just begun to be conceived. There was actually, Le Corbusier was not on the scene. There was an American architect, Matthew Nowicki, who had been hired to plan and conceive the city, who died in an air crash. And it was one of the great bureaucrats from Punjab who actually thought of Chandigarh, thought of Le Corbusier for Chandigarh, went to Paris, proposed it to Nehru, and Nehru wholeheartedly approved. I'm going to show you a few buildings that my father did. He worked for his whole life with the government, with the CPWD, this Public Works Department. He was brought to Delhi by Nehru after Nehru met him in Calcutta in 1949, because he said that this is, we're going to build the new India, we're building the new capital, we need trained people like you. So because of Nehru, an entire generation of very newly trained Indian architects were brought to Delhi from Bombay, from Calcutta, from other cities, many of whom were being trained in Europe or in a handful in America. This was 1961, the Rabindra Bhavan, which is the Lalit Kala Academy gallery, and this is as you see it. And this building, actually, Nehru had a direct hand. That first picture I showed you was Nehru looking at the plans, because as I said, my father had trained under Gropius and was doing these office buildings which were very Bauhaus in style. These pictures, by the way, are all by my father. He was a very good photographer himself, which is another reason it kind of filtered into me, but much later. I'm not sure I'm as good a photographer as him, but what happened was that the building he did for this memorial to Tagore in 1961, Nehru got very upset because he said this looks like an office building and it has nothing to do with India. And you have already done these memorials to Maulana Azad outside the mosque here, and to Gandhi in Barrackpur, which have a Indian sensibility, yet are modern in their conception and construction. And my father got very upset. He said, I've never done an office building or a large institutional building with that spirit. So Nehru actually goaded him into developing a visual language which became the Rabindra Bhavan. These were flats that were being done. My father did a lot of housing in Delhi, a lot of government housing. This is Curzon Road hostels. These are, again, his pictures. A very different building, which was not a government building. This is the Sheila Cinema in Paharganj, which was done actually for a friend. And sadly, I just learned last week that this is going to be demolished because it was India's first 70 mm cinema. But the interesting thing here was, since it was a place of entertainment, he had a bit of fun with color. And that mural was designed by a young architect who had come here from Canada, Luc Durand, who's still alive and lives in Montreal. And Luc Durand actually had been the roommate of John Bissell at the time that John Bissell and he were living in a Barsati in Golf Links, as John Bissell was conceiving what became Fab India. And this kurta, of course, is Fab India. So this is a little bit of the cultural history of the time. This is the cinema. These are my photographs, by the way. What happens is I study photography. I went to do physics in MIT in the 70s, but I ran into an incredible photography department, got passionately involved with photography, came back to Delhi doing photographs, and since all these architects I had grown up with said, okay, you're doing pictures, so do pictures of our buildings. So I started, making pictures of their buildings. This was for Charles Correa, Raj Rewal, for Stein, Doshi, Sabiki, you name it. So this is the kind of work that I was doing. This, of course, is my father's own building. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. This is Raj Rewal, the Parliament Library building next to the Parliament House. Pretty straightforward architectural pictures, as you can see. IMP, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, Qatar. This was actually for Hussein's 95th birthday. Hussein had been exiled after being attacked by the Shiv Sena and BJP. A number of his galleries were attacked in Delhi and Ahmedabad, and his house was attacked in Bombay. And cases were lodged against him. It was kind of the beginning of what happened just now with Padmavati, the film. And this is something that we are seeing increasingly all over India. So I had gone there for his 95th birthday celebration. He, of course, was in exile, renounced his Indian citizenship tragically, and died in exile in London. So these were shot at that time. This is IMP's building. And many projects I had done. Interestingly, a book with Joseph Stein's daughter-in-law, which was a book on courtyards and gardens of Morocco. Something, again, completely different, looking at traditional architecture. These are actually pictures of the book. And the book, we talked a lot earlier today about this notion of architectural photography, building, and light. And this was an absolutely remarkable book done by Robert Elwall, who was the photography curator at the Royal Institute of British Architects, passed away a few years ago. It's a remarkable book. I'm sure many of you as architects have seen it, but it really goes through the entire history of architectural photography from the mid-19th century till about 15 years ago. And it's incredibly well thought out, and this whole notion actually of building with light is beautifully played out through the pages of the book. And I didn't know what he was doing. He just asked me for a photograph, which is here on the right-hand page, which was Charles Correa's Jawahar Kala Kendra, actually even before it was fully finished. But if you see the pictures that he's chosen on this page, which are all in color, and all really have to do with that notion of form and light. And they're all contemporary buildings. And this was a book that I'm most proud to be in because it's a really wonderful book. I'd also been designing, actually. I'd done a bit of architecture myself. I'd designed exhibitions with my colleague, Ronesh Ray. This was 1986, an exhibition called Calm Space and the Act of Space, in which I had photographed, helped conceive spaces, the entire, kind of like what you've done here. We rebuilt the entire inside of Rabindra Bhavan because you couldn't hang things on the wall. At that time, you still can't because they're plaster walls. So we built an entire shell which was architectural. It was a pretty amazing exhibition, models from all over the world. And many years later, the Indira Gandhi Memorial, small exhibition initially. This was when Rajiv was Prime Minister. This is at the rooms that she lived in Safdarjung Road. I was responsible for the photo editing, putting the frames together. So this is another aspect of, at least of how I have worked, both as a designer and a photographer. This is still up. They've just changed the frames, I discovered. They were off-white to match the wall, and now they're silver. And this was an exhibition, you know, I got really interested in kind of the history of our architecture, particularly in the last few years, particularly the history of the first generation of modernists, and especially what happened in Delhi, because I began to realize that the modern architecture in Delhi actually was really remarkable, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, coming into the mid-70s. And it was significant on an absolutely international level. So this was a project I did at the India Art Fair 2 years ago, which was on my father's work. And that picture is Nehru at the Gandhi Ghat. But what I started doing is contextualizing the historic work with the other photography I was doing. So that's a picture of a dilapidated, found bust of Jawaharlal Nehru in the Gold Dak Khana building, which is pretty much ruined, which is under restoration now. This was the inside. As part of my interest in looking back at that period, I also started curating exhibitions, particularly on architectural photography, which had not been done in India at the time. This was the industrial work by the great Bengali photographer, Shunil Jana, who had been a member of the Communist Party in Bengal and has a remarkable range of work from the 1940s and the 1950s. I'm going to show you the work that he did when all the new industrialization is happening in the Nehruvian India, particularly in Bengal and Bihar. Jana had traveled in the mid-1940s with Margaret Burke White, the great American photographer, who had done incredible industrial pictures both in the US and in Soviet Russia in the late 1920s. He was quite influenced by her, as you can see in these photographs. So I got interested in sort of replacing this work in the public, because much of this work had never been published, had not been seen. So in a way, it was kind of rehistoricizing a history that we had lost. And luckily, few years before he passed away, he was already quite ill, was Madan Mahata, the great photographer from Delhi. And Madan I knew because I'd grown up watching him. He'd photographed my father's work, he'd photographed other architects. But as I started doing architectural photography, I realized how absolutely fantastic Madan's work was. And I managed to approach him and Devika Daulat Singh from Photo Inc., who had started a gallery. Technology had changed. You could then, scan negatives which were maybe not in very good shape, digitally print them pretty close to gelatin silver printing in the papers which had just come out at that time, Barita. So I sat with Madan and went through this, and he asked me, he said, who's going to be interested? He started giving all his negatives away to the architects, and I had to run all over Delhi and twist their arms and get them all back. But we did this show maybe 5 years ago. And Madan he came back to Delhi in 1955, and it's a really remarkable thing because you had a great photographer who had a terrific eye. You had this terrific architecture being done. That first building is Shivnath Prasad, Sri Ram Center. This is State Trading Corporation, Rewal. IIT Delhi, J.K. Chowdhury, architect. Also IIT. Last year I did an exhibition at the Kiran Nadar Museum, which I curated, called Delhi Building the Modern. And one of the reasons for doing that was this 2 or 3 year long effort that I and many people in Delhi and actually across the world had got involved in, was to try and save the Hall of Nations in Pragati Maidan from being destroyed by this current government. So I got the original models from Raj Rewal, who's there, which were shown at the Kiran Nadar Museum, along with the amazing engineering drawings by Mahinder Raj. Kuldeep Singh's NDMC building. And looking back at my father's work, I began to look at how modernism had lived. How many minutes? Okay, 5. We'll go through very quickly. How modernism had lived, and those are before and after pictures of the buildings. That's this original staircase on the right, and on the left is what it has become. Curzon Road Hostels. The ISBT bus terminal, which I contextualized with Le Corbusier's Carpenter Center and Harvard. Detail. This is, of course, modernism as it's being lived and used. Buildings as they were being altered, damaged. I'll end with this, hopefully in 5 minutes. This is a big work that I've just sent off to Houston. This is now how I'm beginning to show both my documentary and my architectural work, and I'm combining it with the poster work that I've done with Sehmat, the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, of which I've been a founding member. And this whole work is actually on building an architectural site as site of conflict. So this is on modern Delhi. That's Rabindra Bhavan, which has been altered, and had a big fight over that in 2009. And alongside you see pictures which are related to the history of the development of that building and the political figures. In contemporary terms, you see a costume party in Delhi with somebody dressed as Maulana Azad, cutouts of Gandhi, Maulana Azad, the destroyed Nehru bust. The second half of that panel, that's a fairly late picture of the Hall of Nations, which was still pretty much in use. There was no reason for that building to be torn down. it could have been very easily adapted to modern usage. And of course, the building torn down on the right. Next to that is my situation, my house where I live in Civil Lines, which is next to the cemetery where the 1857 British soldiers are buried from the great 1857 rebellion. So I'm literally living on top of a British dead, the Oberoi Apartments, which I'm quite happy about. On the top is a poster I had done on the destruction of Delhi. That, of course, is a very tragic event. And these I made images of hats by the two people who actually were responsible for tearing that building down. This was the Delhi poster on the destruction of the city by the British. That's where I live, right next to the Kashmiri Gate, with maps. And this segues into both Ayodhya and New York 9/11. That's my loft, which was very near the World Trade Center. And I lost my loft because of post 9/11. I'll be 2 minutes. So I'm combining the work now with newspaper cuttings of the incidents. Those are pictures from Ayodhya, which were in our famous Sehmat exhibition, Hum Sab Ayodhya, which was attacked by the Bajrang Dal. And court cases, including sedition, were filed on us, which we fought for 8 years and won. This was the poster that I had done, which led to that. On the top, actually, are remarkable drawings done by Ravindra Bhan, the architect and landscape designer who had restored the ghats in Ayodhya. You get a little water also for the last 2 minutes. And this was my New York loft, which Anita had actually been in, and the World Trade Towers. And then I moved into Punjab from another Sehmat poster on Jallianwala Bagh, looking back at the positive nationalist history of Punjab. Again, a site which was a bloody site where the British had killed so many people. And then architectural pictures which I did for Moshe Safdie, which is the Khalsa Heritage Center. So I was interested in this whole notion of looking back at histories which are contested, troubled in our times. And iconic pictures of the survivors of the 1984 riots in Delhi. So I'm combining all of these together. And then I end there with the Gulbarg Society in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. And these are actually almost building-scaled images which are being mounted on the wall of those ruined buildings. And inside that are portraits of the people who survived. And I had actually mounted these portraits inside the ruins on the 10th anniversary. And these are the widows coming to the site at that time. And for me, this has been the most significant exhibition that I've ever done. Thank you.